Could a supervolcano end human civilization? That's a scary thought, and it's one a lot of people think about. It's not just science fiction, these things have happened before, and they will happen again. The real question is what it would do to us, to everything we've built. First, let's just talk about what a supervolcano even is. It's not like the volcanoes you see on TV, the ones that just ooze lava or send up a small ash cloud. A supervolcano is something else entirely. It's a monster. We call its eruptions VEI 8. That stands for Volcanic Explosivity Index. A normal big eruption might be a VEI 5 or 6. A supervolcano is an 8. That's a huge jump. It means it throws out over 1,000 cubic kilometers of material. That's a lot of rock and ash. It's enough to cover entire continents in feet of ash. These volcanoes don't look like mountains, not usually. They are often huge calderas. A caldera is a big basin. It forms when a volcano erupts so violently that its magma chamber empties. Then the ground above it collapses. Think of Yellowstone National Park. That whole park is basically a giant supervolcano caldera. It's been dormant for a long time, but it has erupted before, and those eruptions were massive. Toba in Indonesia is another one. That one erupted about 74,000 years ago. It changed the whole planet. So, what happens if one of these things blows? The immediate area around the volcano would be destroyed instantly. Pyroclastic flows would surge out. These are superheated clouds of ash and gas. They move at hundreds of miles per hour. They incinerate everything in their path. There's no escaping them if you're close enough. Cities nearby would vanish. Forests would burn. Rivers would boil. Then comes the ash. Ash is a big problem. It's not like campfire ash. Volcanic ash is sharp. It's like tiny pieces of glass. It gets everywhere. It would fall for hundreds, maybe thousands of miles. Locally, it could be feet deep. This much ash makes things very dark. It blocks out the sun. Daytime would look like a deep twilight, or even total darkness. Ash causes immediate problems. It clogs engines. Cars stop working. Airplanes can't fly. Their engines would seize up. Power grids would fail. The ash coats power lines. It shorts them out. Communications would go down. Cell towers covered in ash don't work. Satellites could be affected too. Dust and debris in the atmosphere mess with signals. Everything we rely on for modern life would just stop. People would struggle to breathe. The ash gets into lungs. It causes serious respiratory problems. Hospitals would be overwhelmed. People would need masks, but for how long? And what about the people who already have breathing issues? It would be a nightmare for them. But the real long-term disaster isn't just the ash nearby. That's just the beginning. The biggest problem is what happens to the whole planet. A supervolcano eruption blasts a huge amount of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. This gas mixes with water vapor. It forms tiny sulfuric acid aerosols. These aerosols don't fall out quickly. They stay up there for years, and they reflect sunlight back into space. This is where the term volcanic winter comes from. Less sunlight reaches the Earth's surface. The planet cools down. It can get much colder. We're not talking about a little chill. We're talking about global temperatures dropping by several degrees. Maybe even 10 degrees or more. That might not sound like much, but it makes a huge difference to everything on Earth. Farming would be devastated. This is the biggest problem. Most of our food comes from crops. Crops need sunlight to grow. They need the right temperatures. If it's dark and cold for years, crops will fail. Harvests would shrink dramatically, or they would stop entirely in many places. Imagine this for a moment. No food, or very little food, for years. Our current food system relies on constant production. We don't store much food for long periods. Supermarkets would be empty in days, maybe weeks. People would get hungry, very hungry. This would lead to widespread famine. Millions, even billions of people would starve. But it's not just food. Water systems would be affected. Lakes and rivers could freeze. Or they could be contaminated with ash and acid rain. Yes, acid rain. These sulfuric acid aerosols in the atmosphere would come down as acid rain. This acid rain would hurt ecosystems, it would damage buildings, it would make water supplies unsafe. And the oceans would absorb some of the carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds. This could lead to ocean acidification that would harm marine life, fish stocks would crash, another source of food gone. The global economy would collapse. It couldn't function without trade. Without transportation, without communication, without food, everything would grind to a halt. Money would become worthless. People would focus only on survival, on finding food and water. Social structures would break down, governments would struggle to cope, they might not even exist anymore in many places. Riots would be common. People would fight over scarce resources. There would be no police, no laws. It would be a struggle for survival, plain and simple. What about our modern infrastructure? The power plants would struggle. Their cooling systems might get clogged with ash, or they'd just stop working because of widespread power grid failures. Nuclear power plants would need constant cooling. Without power, they become a huge risk. They could melt down. That's another disaster on top of the first one. Medicine would be scarce. Hospitals wouldn't function. Doctors wouldn't have supplies. Diseases would spread rapidly. People would be weakened by hunger and cold. Sanitation would fail. All the progress we've made in public health could vanish. How many people could even survive such an event? It's hard to say. Maybe a small fraction of the current population. Maybe a few million, maybe even fewer. They would be scattered in isolated pockets. They would live in a world changed beyond recognition. They would face immense challenges. Could anyone be prepared for this? Not really. Not on a global scale. Some governments talk about emergency preparedness. They tell people to have a few days of food and water. That's for a local disaster. Not for a global catastrophe that lasts for years. Building bunkers wouldn't really help the whole civilization. A few rich people might survive in their bunkers, but they would emerge into a dead world. Or a world where they are hunted for their resources. It's not a solution for humanity. What about our technology, all our data, our knowledge? Could it survive? Maybe some of it. But if the power's out, if the internet is down, if the servers are destroyed, then a lot of our collective knowledge would be lost. We would lose centuries of progress. Think about the sheer psychological impact. Living in constant darkness, freezing cold, starving, watching everyone around you suffer and die. The hope would drain away. It would be a nightmare that never ends, for years. And then, if some people do survive, what kind of world would they live in? The environment would be scarred. The climate would be different. The land would be barren. They would have to start from scratch. With very little, they would be living in a new Stone Age. Maybe even worse. They would have to rediscover basic skills. They would have to rebuild everything. And they would have very few people to do it. Could human civilization end? Yes, it seems very possible. If by end of civilization we mean the collapse of all complex societies, governments, economies, and our current way of life, then a supervolcano could certainly do that. It would reset the clock. It would throw humanity back thousands of years. It would cause a bottleneck. A very severe reduction in human population. But would it mean the end of humanity? That's a harder question. Humans are very adaptable. We are resilient. Small groups might find ways to survive. They might scavenge. They might learn to farm in new harsh conditions. They might find geothermal heat in some places to stay warm. They might live underground. They might adapt to a much colder, darker world. But this wouldn't be civilization as we know it. Sure. It would be a struggle for existence, a constant battle against hunger, cold, and disease. It would be a brutal world. The survivors would carry the trauma of what happened. They would pass down stories of the Great Darkness or the Long Winter. The chances of a supervolcano erupting are not zero. Yellowstone, for example, has erupted 3 times in the last 2.1 million years. The last one was about 631,000 years ago. Geologically speaking, that's not that long ago. And there are other supervolcanoes around the world. Toba, Campi Flegrei in Italy, Taupo in New Zealand. They are all being watched. Scientists monitor them closely. They look for signs of unrest. Ground swelling, gas emissions, earthquake swarms. But we can't predict them with perfect accuracy. We might get some warning, weeks, maybe months. But even that warning wouldn't give us enough time to prepare for a global event. You can't just move billions of people. You can't just build enough food reserves for everyone for years. So, when people ask if a supervolcano could end human civilization, the honest answer seems to be yes. It wouldn't necessarily wipe out every single human being, but it would shatter our societies. It would destroy our way of life. It would decimate our population. It would force us back to a primitive existence. The world would be remade, and the people who survived would be living in a very different, much harsher world than anything we can imagine today. It's a sobering thought. We live on a planet that can, at times, be incredibly violent. And some of those violent events can change everything. It's a reminder of how fragile our civilization truly is. We build up complex systems. We rely on perfect conditions. And a supervolcano shows us how easily all of that can be taken away. It's not about if, but when the Earth will show its power again, and we might not be ready for it.